Well, Donald Trump continues to purge all dissenting officials and is clearing all criminal cases that were initiated against him and his supporters. This time, Donald Trump started firing investigators and prosecutors who had previously worked on cases involving him. For example, it became known that in the United States Department of Justice, more than 20 people involved in the cases about Donald Trump storing classified documents and attempts to overturn the election results were fired, the year 2020. Earlier, 3 prosecutors who were handling high-profile cases related to the storming of the Capitol were suddenly fired in the United States, January 6, 2021. In addition to this, the United States State Department is firing more than 1,350 employees during an unprecedented reform of the diplomatic corps by President Donald Trump's administration. And it seems like this is just the beginning of all the purges of dissenters. And in this episode, I will give a lot of specific cases of how Trump's team is taking revenge on those who acted against him and his allies. My name is Alexei Pecci. Today is July 13th. Next, we'll go through everything step by step. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link is in the video description. So this week, Donald Trump's team continued openly firing all the high-ranking officials whom Trump didn't like or who were even handling cases against him. This time, the purge happened in the United States Department of Justice, and as reported, the Department of Justice unexpectedly fired more than 20 employees who were working on investigations involving Donald Trump. This is already being called an outright purge among Department of Justice officials who were investigating President Trump and his closest allies. Interestingly, all those who were fired were involved in Trump-related cases. There isn't a single person who was fired who wasn't connected to Donald Trump's cases. According to one source familiar with the dismissals, more than 20 people were fired who had worked on former Special Prosecutor Jack Smith's case about classified documents against Trump and Smith's investigation into Trump's attempts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. So Trump's team decided that they just needed to remove everyone who could have completed the investigation. According to the source, at least 35 employees of the Department of Justice who worked with Prosecutor Smith on the 2 investigations he supervised were fired. And at least 15 more employees may be fired in the coming days. Sources reported that among those fired were legal assistants who worked in Prosecutor Smith's office, financial and support staff, as well as 2 other Department of Justice prosecutors in North Carolina and Florida. Moreover, at the end of June, 3 prosecutors who were handling high-profile Capitol riot cases were suddenly fired in the United States. January 6, 2021. The decision took effect immediately and was not accompanied by an official explanation. Sources report that these are the latest steps by President Donald Trump's administration aimed at lawyers involved in the mass prosecution following the January 6, 2021 attack. As it turned out, among those dismissed were 2 lawyers who served as lead prosecutors for the January 6 cases in the United States Attorney's Office in Washington, as well as a line attorney who was investigating cases related to the attack on the Capitol. The letter received by one of the prosecutors was signed by Attorney General Pam Bondi. Strangely, the letter did not specify the reason for their dismissal, but it stated that the termination was effective immediately. In other words, the prosecutors were simply told, like, you're fired without any explanation. Let me briefly remind you, January 6, 2021. 2 weeks before the end of his presidential term, Trump spoke at a rally called Save America in Washington. Because of his defeat in the election, Trump's rhetoric was quite aggressive. And on the same day, supporters of Donald Trump marched to the Capitol, where both chambers of Congress had gathered for a session to officially certify Joe Biden's victory. Trump's supporters managed to break into the Capitol building, so the congressional session was interrupted and some lawmakers were even evacuated. During the storming of the Capitol, several people were killed and the building itself suffered significant damage. But this year, specifically on January 12th, Trump pardoned his supporters who stormed Congress in 2021 and simply ordered the case to be closed. Although there was a very interesting episode here. One of the participants in the storming of the Capitol refused Donald Trump's pardon. She called it a disregard for the rule of law. Her name is Pamela Hemphill, and here is her quote in response to Trump's pardon: "It would be a slap in the face to the rule of law, the Capitol Police, and our nation." According to one source, all the employees dismissed from the United States Department of Justice today were identified by the so-called Department of Justice Weapons Enforcement Task Force, which Attorney General Pam Bondi established as one of her main priorities after taking office. According to the source, the Attorney General created the Weapons Enforcement Task Force to analyze the Biden administration's law enforcement policies. The group is studying 2 federal cases against Trump initiated by former Special Counsel Smith and is reviewing the prosecutions of the rioters who stormed the United States Capitol on January 6th. It is also reviewing court cases related to Trump in New York. The hush money case brought by Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg and the civil lawsuit against Trump Organization filed by the New York Attorney General, Letitia James. Federal prosecutors were not involved in any of these cases, but Trump decided to go all out just to get rid of absolutely everyone who was even remotely involved in the investigations against him. But that's not all. When the Department of Justice began gathering information about FBI agents who worked on the investigation of the January 6th Capitol attack and fired the staff prosecutors who were working on these cases. Pam Bondi stated in her directive that the task force would investigate, quote, "improper investigative methods and unethical prosecutions as opposed to the good faith actions of federal employees who are simply following orders." But this means that the investigators and prosecutors were not just fired, but could also be held accountable for their work. One of the dismissed employees of the United States Department of Justice was Petty Hartman, who held the position of lead public relations specialist at the FBI and federal prosecutors' offices. She worked in the public relations group of the District of Columbia Prosecutor's Office, which distributed press releases about more than 1,500 criminal cases initiated in connection with the case. January 6th. After being fired, she said, "The rules no longer exist. There used to be a boundary, a very clear separation between the White House and the Department of Justice because one shouldn't interfere with the other's work. Now that boundary has definitely disappeared." But that's not all. Today it became known that the United States State Department is firing more than 1,350 employees. During the unprecedented reform of the diplomatic corps by Donald Trump's administration, massive layoffs are happening at the United States State Department, which is actually responsible for United States foreign policy and diplomatic relations at the same time when Washington is facing numerous crises around the world. This encompasses Russia's full-scale war on Ukraine, Israel's war in Gaza, the Israel-Iran war, and Trump's declared trade wars against China, Mexico, Canada, the European Union, and others. It's crucial to recognize that the United States State Department serves as the country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But as stated in an internal message from the State Department that was sent out to employees, quote, "The department is optimizing internal operations to focus on diplomatic priorities." And they also added that the cuts affect people who were supposedly performing non-core functions, duplicating someone else's work, as well as the dismissal of redundant departments. But it seems that this is only the beginning, because as stated by the United States State Department, this is only the first stage of the reform initiated by Trump to align United States foreign policy with the principles of the America First slogan. Former diplomats and critics of Trump's policy warned that firing diplomats will weaken the ability of the United States to counter the influence of China and Russia. And it's important to note here that this is probably one of the most absurd decisions that could possibly be made. At a time when China, for example, on the contrary, is actively expanding its diplomatic presence around the world and creating an overseas network of military and transportation bases. Russia continues its years-long brutal assault on sovereign Ukraine while the Middle East is going through crisis after crisis. At this time, they are downsizing the department responsible for United States foreign policy. The reorganization of the State Department was planned to be completed by July 1, but it has been delayed due to lawsuits. The State Department was awaiting a Supreme Court decision on the Trump administration's attempt to overturn a court ban on mass layoffs. But, as unfortunate as it may sound, the court also seems to be on Trump's side now. The other day, the court ruled that the Trump administration can continue cutting staff in a number of agencies. They said it's a completely legal procedure, so it's possible to fire everyone without giving any reason. Other than a purge, I don't know what else to call it. In your opinion, what's happening? Write in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and don't forget to like.